Welcome to Supply Chain 4.0, All You Need to Know, a 5-part podcast series powered by Procurious and sponsored by IBM Watson Supply Chain. With so many dynamic changes happening in the supply chain profession, are you struggling to keep up with the latest trends? Never fear, because in this series we've got it covered as we're addressing how to define where your supply chain begins and ends, how blockchain will improve supply chain visibility, the latest technologies impacting your supply chain, and how to make supply chain management your organisation's competitive advantage. Today I'm very excited to be speaking with Alice Sadhu, someone I've known for many years and who works very closely with Melbourne Business School and is a director of a number of digital startups in this part of the world. Today, Alice is going to share with us her views on how we can make supply chain our organisation's competitive advantage. Thanks for joining us today, Alice.
Thanks for having me, Tanya. I'm excited to be here.
Well, great. Given this is a punchy podcast, the two Ps, let's get stuck right into it. How can supply chain pros be more strategic?
Well, it's actually a great question, and it goes back to the introduction for this podcast. One of the things is looking at what's happening outside, understanding the industry, the trends, some of the technology that you mentioned. Blockchain seems to be the topic du jour at the moment, but there's so many other ones as well. How mobility, IoT, and things like artificial intelligence can help improve and really transform what's happening from a supply chain perspective. And the other piece is actually to really understand internally the organisation's business strategy and where it is the organisation wants to go, not just in that financial year or that financial quarter, but year on year, and then the plan around that and how supply chain can then play a part by aligning to what it is that needs to happen. So it's kind of a really exciting time to be in that part of the organisation and that part of the business.
It is, but I think a lot of people obviously still struggle with, being able to raise their heads and get out of the detail to actually see that strategic landscape. It's always been a challenge for us, but I think more than ever people really need to sort of step away from the day-to-day and try and see what's happening with this landscape, and I guess that's what this series is all about.
Absolutely right. And the challenge of, I think, anyone, not just in supply chain, but anyone, is how do you manage the day-to-day when it seems to be all-encompassing, and actually have a chance to turn your lens out to what it is that's happening either in another part of the business, or even just to take a helicopter view of your own business, much less worry about what's going on outside. So some things that I would recommend would be looking at what it is that's happening in your business area that's giving you pain and taking up a lot of time, and then, not just dropping what it is that's doing so you can actually turn and spend 100% of your attention on those, those new strategic ideas, but really to say, how can I make, a day a week or half a day a week or whatever it is, allocated and to prioritise what it is that needs to happen so I can change my business. Because I can guarantee you, and you and I, as you said, have known each other for a really long time. So I've been in those roles where you're trying to actually do the day-to-day and you think, I haven't got time for this. So the first thing is a mindset shift to say, you do have time for this, you have to make time for it, because this isn't an extra part of your job, it actually is your job. And then the other part is that sort of utopia at the end, which is the promised land of knowing that if you actually turn your attention to this, that you will actually improve the way you work. And most of the time, in the types of things that I've done, I've actually found that I and my team have always had more time. So it's just kind of like biting the bullet and making that decision to actually do something.
And of course, one of those really rewarding things that if you can get that helicopter view and get some focus on is this whole idea of purpose and sustainability. And, I know that's bringing a lot of job satisfaction to a lot of professionals around the world, being able to ensure that they are building these sustainable supply chains, although it's not easy. I guess, what do you see as the value that sustainable supply chains are bringing to organisations?
Oh, it's such an interesting question with everything that's going on. So everybody talks about the digital landscape and how, it might be different or from traditional organisations, and how it's, again, something that's happening. It's not integrated into the organisation. But the big opportunity of supply chains is, as recently as, 6 or 12 months ago, we've seen what's happened with Tesla. So you talk about sustainability from the environmental side, in electric cars and the industry disruption there, and sustainability from the ability of the organisation to actually operate and then continue to operate sustainably for a long term. And the interesting thing that's happened there is, that they have not been able to deal with as effectively as they could have with the distribution of the cars, which is essentially a supply chain issue. And so what a wonderful opportunity to be able to, in that position, influence the distribution of cars, which is essentially, what anyone wants to do, which is you want to be able to make something, and then you want to be able to have your customers actually consume it. And so that's what supply chain's all about. Yeah, getting it to your end customer. So if you take a different lens on what it is that you're supposed to do, then you're enabling, all the creativity, all of the marketing, all the innovation to actually reach the end customer. So what could be more amazing than that?
When we look to the future, I sort of talk about supply chain professionals sort of being in the middle of this hub, and a digitally enabled hub, and really our core strength is going to be managing relationships and resolving issues within that network of suppliers. When you think about supply relationship management, which isn't a new thing, it's not necessarily a 4.0 issue, how are you thinking that, SRM will add value to the business?
It's pretty much all about adding value through SRM. I know, it's interesting. It reminds me, your question reminds me of that comment, the more things change, the more they stay the same. And what you're talking about, it's not 4.0, but that doesn't mean that it's not foundational or fundamental. And the reason, that it becomes so important is because digital is all about fast, and it's all about making sure that you create value for that end customer. And you can't do it alone. And I think the important thing about SRM is that you have to change the relationship that you have with your suppliers if you're not dealing with them in a way that says we're in it for the long term and we're in it to create value together. Actually, even if you're in it for a shorter term, I don't even know what long term is in digital anymore, you still have to have that view about what it is that you want to achieve together. And earlier you mentioned that whole concept of purpose. Suppliers have it too. They want to be able to know that they're creating value and that they're doing that with people that understand what they're all about. And so that whole idea of, partnering doesn't have to necessarily mean, 5 or 10 years. In some businesses it may, but it really is about saying, let's approach it in a different way. And SRM is foundational to that. You can't really have that type of relationship and engagement if you don't have a really robust SRM framework and then an approach around those relationships. Yeah.
I couldn't agree more, and it's about the alignment around those values actually that create some of the most powerful supply relationships, isn't it? So that all those issues dovetail into each other. Earlier in the week, we spoke with Tom Linton, and he talked a lot about velocity in supply chains and had a lot of energy about how we can increase the velocity of our supply chains. What do you think supply chain pros can do to minimise lead times and delays?
I think they need to get digital, actually. And I know, and I don't say that just because it's the buzzword bingo of the day. It's actually because it's true. Because when you get digital, you're automating things. Everything is happening online, and hopefully it's happening in real time. So these days of doing analysis on lead times and stock turnover or inventory management and taking 8 weeks or 10 weeks or however long to actually, come up with those analytics and findings, it's actually not good enough. The world's changing so much in that time. And the other thing is, consumers expect things to be completely different as well. I mean, I don't know about you, but if something takes longer than, 3 days to get to me, it's kind of like a national emergency. Why is it taking so long? Where is it coming from?
Right. We both share a love of fashion, so the Zara case study comes to mind, as well as online shopping delivery. So even from a personal perspective, this is very critical. Look, what are some other ways that the supply chain pros can actually help, create competitive advantage for their organisation? Is there anything we haven't touched on so far?
It's really the whole idea of bringing everything together, really understanding not just where the business wants to go, but also the insights from the external market, looking at what the industry is doing, looking at what competitors are doing, and then also, the whole digital concept is around integration of adjacent markets and industries. And so not everything has to come from what it is that's happening. And a lot of the time, I want to make this point in particular, a lot of the time what happens is we look around us and we say we're okay because we're doing the same as what someone else is doing, or they're not doing anything different. And one of the things that's really reinforced as a theme in this whole sort of digital economy and the way ecosystems are now working is that so in the digital world, you don't know where your competition is going to come from. And so if you're looking at what your competitors are doing, then you may be not really understanding that your competition may come from an adjacent industry. So you really need to understand that. And then the second thing is, particularly in some areas, we talked about manufacturing before, automotive, there are now competitors that are actually collaborating. And they're not collaborating for collusion, but they're collaborating for innovation, and because no one wants to be left behind. And so that's the other thing around the type of thinking that supply chain professionals can bring in. And so even that insight, is valuable, much less, strategies on how to execute on that.
Alice, I'm going to pick up on that comment. Nobody wants to get left behind for my last question. The last thing I want is for supply chain to be left behind. So how do we as professionals make sure we're communicating to the CEOs, the CFOs about the value we deliver?
It's always been a very clear objective, I guess, of any function to be able to talk about what it is that they contribute and the value that they bring that actually impacts how the business operates. And that might be, as we've talked about, through new markets or insights or bottom line benefits. And so what supply chain people need to do is really understand that, the marketing, in inverted commas, of the value is actually really, really important. It's not just the PowerPoint presentation, and it's not the being asked to go into a room once a year to seek money for your budget. It's really about enabling those conversations and the constant communication, the regular updates, the insights, again, as we've talked about, that actually enable this sort of channel of communication, because any C-suite executive, any board, any, executive below the C-suite even, because, not everybody listening will be perhaps at that level, but everybody wants to know something that is going to impact, positively or negatively how they do their job, because sometimes the value that you can actually share or demonstrate is actually about knowing that you know something, and risk is a part of that as well. So just that whole communication and being able to create something that is meaningful is the way to go, and not assume that everybody knows, and that someone else is going to do it for you is also the thing I would say as well. That is someone else's job.
Yeah, I think that point that, it's not a one-off, it's not an annual event, it's not a quarterly, it's a conversation that is continuous. And that's how we gain alignment. We can't operate in a vacuum, and if you do, then someone else will sort of fill that void, won't they?
Yes.
So, very critical. Well, Alice, thank you so much for your insights today. And, of course, for all our listeners, you've been listening to Supply Chain 4.0, All You Need to Know, a podcast series powered by Procurious and sponsored by IBM Watson Supply Chain. If you'd like more related content, please check out the Supply Chain Pros group on Procurious.